Hi everyone, I'm Irene. This is Perpetually Paperback, a little different look than normal, a little different video than normal. I turn 30 years old tomorrow, and I thought I would do 30 book recommendations for my 30th birthday. So these are going to be some books that influenced me throughout my childhood, some that I really love, some that I don't love any longer, but I loved at the time. So I read ever since I was a wee child. I don't ever remember not reading, but I'm going to start with the books that I remember loving the most. And for me, I was a huge Nancy Drew fan. I've always loved her. The Nancy Drew books by Caroline Keene. I used to have so many of them. I don't think I ever had the full series, but I had tons of them. And then a family friend of ours ended up giving us all of their daughter's books, so I ended up getting so many more. I just absolutely loved them. I don't think they hold up very well now, but they were just so much fun. So I think those are just great books. The next book I'm going to talk about is a Greek myth book that I will put up in one of these corners. But it is basically just a children's book that I got. It was a gift that was given to my family when I was a lot younger. And the myths were just I always loved myths and mythology, and I didn't even really know it yet. This book just became my everything. It's still one of my favorite books. It talks about all of the stories of Greek mythology that actually are going to be revisited in a later recommendation. After that, I've got some kid young adult books, and these I actually remember very, very little about them, except that I just loved them as a child. They were really immersive stories. One of them is actually called The Last of the Really Great Whangdoodles by Julie Andrews, and I'm going to put all of these books up. But this is a kid's book about, it kind of reminds me of the Lorax, so it's kind of like a more modern take on a Lorax, but it's a group of kids, and it's just so cute. I read that a little bit later on, and that one holds up really well. Julie Andrews is an amazing writer. She does write kids books, and if you haven't heard of them or checked them out, I really recommend you do so. They're wonderful. Okay, this one is one that it's called the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, and this is, I love these. Okay, so I loved stories that were adventure stories, and I grew up with my cousins, so there was always a gang of us. We were just always making up adventures, and we just had so much imagination. So this is about a couple of kids who run away, and they decide that the best place to run away to is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they basically have to discover this. It's kind of like a little mystery. You'll find a theme in all of these. I apparently really like mysteries, but I never really thought about it like that. This is a really, really great kid's story that gets really kind of interesting and into her life and what they find out. It's very, very cute. If you find it, read it. It's adorable. So the next one is one that I ended up finding, and I loved these books. So I loved this series. I used to read anything when I was younger that had princes, princesses, or anything that was set in Victorian era. So this is A Great and Terrible Beauty by Libba Bray. She actually writes the Diviner series that a lot of people may have heard of. This is one from the Gemma Doyle trilogy, and I actually read this when it was first out, before anything else had been written. At this point, there was nothing else to read of hers when I was reading it. And I'm just someone that if the books aren't out, I tend to not continue in a series. And honestly, in this one, I just grew up and got busy and started going to college and reading different things. And I kind of grew out of her books. But honestly, I guarantee you if I were to go back and read them, I would probably eat them up. Whether they hold up or not, but just that childhood me would just find it wonderful. I loved that book. Okay. So now I'm going to move on kind of into some classics. And this is where it might get very, not a little bit, very pretentious, but that's okay because everyone likes what they like. Okay, so the first book recommendation is The Lord of the Flies. This is a very short classic, and it's actually a pretty good one. I remember reading this one in school and kind of honestly liking this one quite a bit just because it was, I tend to like gritty books, and this was a gritty book. It was like very real, and honestly a lot of people may not necessarily like it. It wasn't obviously a pleasant story, but it really provided a good background for a book that I read later that I don't know if I can honestly say I recommend it, but it's Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And that book is a lot to unpack. But, oh, sorry if you hear my cats. Anyway, so that book is a lot to unpack, and it's very heavy, but it kind of was a really good segue into that. If you're checking out classics at all, those are some really interesting ones to check out. The next recommendation is William Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. I don't know if you've read Shakespeare. Most of us have read them in school, things like that. In high school, I took a Myth and Shakespeare class, and it is one of my favorite classes I've ever taken, ever in my life, because the professor was amazing, and he taught us how to read these pieces, but he also made them relevant to like our daily life. So for example, at the time that we read that, Amanda Bynes' She's the Man was out, and if you don't know, She's the Man is a Twelfth Night adaptation, so it made something very relevant to us. And that technically is not my favorite, but I think if there's any recommendation of Shakespeare to do, always go with a comedy. My favorite is Richard III, which is like not in like most people aren't necessarily going to be a huge fan, but I really love that one. I, however, would recommend that you start with a comedy, and I really enjoyed Twelfth Night. I think that one's really cool. It's really funny. It's got some really interesting pieces in it. Also, I like when there's material that you can see something kind of modern in. It's a little bit easier to place. It's a little bit easier to kind of delve into the writing and stuff like that, because it's not easy if you're reading it on your own with zero context. But that one is really great, and I do love it. After that, this is one of my favorite books. I was in, I think it was the summer after high school that I was reading this, and I probably read this at like the perfect time in my life where like my comprehension and also like just, I don't know, everything like perfectly was in place for this book, and it's The Count of Monte Cristo, and it is just my favorite. I think I read the perfect adaptation. I love stories like that though. Like I was an Indiana Jones kid. Like I wanted like adventures with everything, and The Count of Monte Cristo just has it. It just has everything. It has murder, it has intrigue, it has revenge, it has love, it has tragedy, it has everything. It's just such a good story. And like you don't necessarily think of classics in the way of like being enjoyable books. They can be. They don't always have to be, horrible and something to get through. Or not horrible, that's not to say. I like reading classics, but it's a struggle to get through and work through them sometimes. It's glorious when they're not that. And The Count of Monte Cristo is just such a good book. You have to think a lot of these books were written at the time to be enjoyable in popular literature. They just aren't anymore, really. That one, man, it holds up. It's so good. Anyway, moving on. After that, I'm going to talk about a couple series that I can't say that I wish to go back to, that I like anymore, and just to be clear, I don't care to support this author in particular anymore, but I would be lying if I didn't say that these series shaped a lot of what I read, a lot of how I read. So it's going to be the Harry Potter series, and these are 30 recommendations, so I'm actually talking about more books than just 30. So the Harry Potter series, they came out when I was in the 3rd grade, and, consequently read each one as it came out. And it was also the first time I remember ever getting that excited about a book with the way that everyone would get excited about the books. And just like devouring something. And I loved when they were long, and the longer the better. And it was just a beautiful love of reading. Loved. So those were the ones that kind of shaped my childhood, and we move on into Twilight. Honestly, when I read those and they came out at the time, I love those. I was in the middle of high school. I was probably a sophomore or junior in high school. I was kind of the perfect demographic. I don't love them anymore at all, not even a little bit. I also find it really irritating how it just sparked this whole, like, vampire trend, craze, whatever it is. I like paranormal. I have no issues with any of it, but it just got tired, and it then became a cycle of like everything that's coming out is now that. And that's kind of what ended up happening with the next one I'm going to talk about, The Hunger Games, because The Hunger Games is actually a really good trilogy. I think it's really good. It kind of has an issue where I think the first one is the best, second is not so good, and the third one was the one I was least interested in, but I think they work in opposite order in movie form. I think it's a book that lent itself really well to a movie adaptation. and I wasn't really unhappy with it, but I think I also, like, I don't tend to be a huge rereader, so I didn't go back to reread them to watch the movie. I would just be looking at heartbreak, so I enjoyed each individually. Yeah. What I mean by I think they sparked it, I think a lot of series after that kind of tried to fit into the same mold. Some worked, some didn't. They could have, found their own mold. But anyway, those were hugely influential in my, childhood and adult life. My next recommendation is this beauty, Edith Hamilton's Mythology. So this is kind of where my love for myths sort of expanded quite a bit. This was actually the textbook. Ooh, I am going to break my book. This was the textbook for my Myth and Shakespeare class. This was the mythology component of it. But by the way, that class ended with a field trip to the Shakespeare Festival in Ashland, Oregon. And that was part of the main reason why you take it, but also it was an outstanding class. Thank you, Mr. Davis. Okay, so this book it's basically a deeper dive into the mythology book from earlier, that was much more of a children's version. This is a much more young adult version. This happens to actually be a really beautiful anniversary edition, but that was not the one we read. I read like a little paperback, trade paperback version of the book. You can find it everywhere. It's brilliant. It's amazing. I would pretty much recommend any book on mythology because some of them are outstanding, but this is a big favorite. Okay, after that, so these books, this is kind of where, the split, I would say. I tried to categorize some of these as much as I could. So the next one is Khaled Hosseini's Thousand Splendid Suns. It's by the same writer that did The Kite Runner. This is a story about two women whose lives intersect. It's written in 3 parts. The third part, their lives intersect. I literally remember reading this. I specifically remember this one. I was reading, I had final, and I think I picked it up the morning of or something like that because I really didn't want to study for my final. And remember staying up until 6 a.m, reading, crying all night. It was literally a book I could not put down. And I just remember, it's so painful. It's so beautiful. It's so painful. Nothing has come close to that amount of emotional pain. But, the story is just gorgeous and devastating. And I really love anything that has to do with cultures I don't know anything about. That was one in particular. It's set in Afghanistan during the Taliban rule or occupation. So my next book is actually also one of my prized possessions, and it looks horrible because it's been through so many hands, but it's also one of the coolest things ever. This was, I just loved Anthony Bourdain. I loved him when I was younger. And we I happened to have met him at some point, and when I did, because of the circumstances, he ended up signing my book. So it was really cool. It was really cool that I got to meet him. The book was, even before I met him, one of my absolute favorites. I really, really love kitchen memoirs or food memoirs in general. I have quite a few of them, but he was also a novelist in his own right, and just a really, really cool person. So that one is going to be my next one. If you haven't read it, honestly, it's great. Start here if you're going to read any of his books, because it's wild and awesome. It just is. Read that one. Okay, so after that, I would say this is a book I probably buy the most and recommend to the most people, especially people that aren't necessarily big readers, because it's a very accessible story that has a lot of deep meaning, and that is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. So it is a story about a boy who kind of goes on a pilgrimage to somewhat sort of find his happiness, and it is just another stunningly beautiful book. It's very, very short. You can literally find it everywhere. There's millions and millions of copies all over the place. If you see it and haven't read it, I seriously recommend that book. I recommend it to, that's probably the most recommended book I have ever. Okay, so moving on to tiny, tiny writing. Okay, so after that I have The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. And this is a bunch of different stories that are all kind of put together to make up a larger one. And they're all about these families that live in San Francisco, and they're Asian American. And kind of about their identities and mothers and daughters and different generations. It is beautiful. I think it's actually considered a modern classic at this point. It it opened the door for me into this genre of kind of historical fiction that I knew nothing about and love so very much to this day. My next recommendation deals specifically with that. It's Snowflower and the Secret Fan by Lisa C. If you're new here, Lisa C is one of my favorite writers. I read the Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane a little bit earlier. I have another one of her books that's coming up, but I've read many of her books throughout the years. Snowflower and the Secret Fan was and is such a hugely influential book for me. It dealt with foot binding, but more so than that, it was a relationship between two women that was just gorgeous. Her writing is beautiful. It is stunning. It is super informative. She researches so incredibly well. Like, she is Chinese American and just takes such a care with all of her books and with all of the subject matter that it also was just, the book binding or the foot binding in that, wow. It stuck with me forever. But also outstanding and beautiful, and read it. Okay. After that, this is the Millennium Trilogy, or all of the Elizabeth Salander books. And this is a series by Stieg Larsson. It's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, The Girl Who Played with Fire, and The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest. Those are the three. I know there are more that are written, but those are the three that he wrote before he died, and then the rest of them were finished later. I believe he had a fourth book that was half written, but then his wife finished it. These books were my first dive into Swedish crime novels, and I know that Jo Nesbø is a really, really popular one, but I'd never heard of him. It was really a struggle to even find these books in English because of the translation. And everyone in my family read it. This was one, a lot of times if there's a good book, it'll go from my mom to my aunt to anyone in our family that's going to read it. But usually that's kind of the three that it would go to. We all read it. That copy was destroyed. Literally destroyed. It was so good. It was it was a genre I've never experienced before, a reading style I'd never experienced before. It was gritty, it was raw, it was ugly, it was difficult to read, it was amazing. Not to mention just I don't know, I actually don't know if I've not read anything crime or thriller wise that has held up to that level of suspense and angst and gruesome horrification, and it was outstanding, and I loved it. I really recommend it. It is not for the faint of heart. It is gruesome, ugly, violent, and terrible. Go read it. Go read it. Ooh, okay, so after that I have this one. It is My Name is Red by Orhan Pamuk, and this is a Turkish writer. He won the Nobel Prize. And this book is about miniaturists in Istanbul. And I read it quite a while ago, and it took me quite a long time to get through it. But one of the big things I really remember about it, it's told in different stories by throughout different perspectives. There's a couple different plot lines, but one of the things that I found really beautiful about it is the way that the perspectives are given in the book. There's just some beautiful lines on life and how life is viewed through different perspectives. It was such a good book. It was lovely. This has so many lines that have never left me after I read it. It was also one that I'd never heard of, didn't know about the author. I dated a dude that did a study abroad in Turkey, and that's how I found out anything about it. But actually this was the best thing that came out of that, because this book was absolutely outstanding. So after that, I've got a couple of series that I'm going to talk about the first book, but if you read the series, you will not be disappointed. So the first one is The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. This one can be read on its own. I could not fathom how you would do that because I had to find out everything that was going to happen. It's a huge tome. It's a 1,000-page book, and it is about a prior who wants to build a cathedral in the middle of a forest in the Middle Ages. There's nothing about this book that sounds good, and truly describing it to anyone it's not going to sound good. It just does not sound interesting. Oh, but it is. It so is. Okay. I can't even put into words how good this book is. It's got so many different storylines to span their whole lives and how they all interconnect with each other. in different physical locations throughout England, but also kind of in the same area. It's these people's master works of their lives and how their lives sort of play out. And it's just, there's so many things that happen throughout their lives that are momentous and so relevant to I'm not even doing a very good job articulating what this book is about. It's so good, though. Their lives are amazing. Everything that happens is action. There is drama. There is love. I like sweeping adventure stories, and this is that. It just happens to be about a prior in a wood in the Middle Ages, building a cathedral. And then the subsequent books are the family lineage as you go forward, so you do find out through the generations more about these people's lives in the later books. And then there's a second trilogy that he writes that after that, I literally could not stop reading his books. I read all of them. Except any of his, he used to write crime thrillers. I didn't read any of those. I didn't hear really good things about him. Everything he's written thus far, with the exception of The Evening in the Sun. It's the prequel that just came out this year. I haven't read that. It's actually on my Christmas list, but we'll see. After that, I really loved this. This was a more recent trilogy for me, but it's the Winter Night Trilogy. So it's The Winter, the Witch, The Girl in the Tower, and that's 3, 2, and 1 is The Girl in the Forest? Hold on. The Bear and the Nightingale. So it's The Bear and the Nightingale, The Girl in the Tower, and The Winter of the Witch. They are based on Russian folklore. They have a strong female lead. There is a horse named Solovey. That's basically all you need. It's outstanding. I really, really loved it because it just so beautifully encompassed winter, and there's something about fairy tales in winter, in dense woods and fighting good and evil that I just can't live without. So a lot of the themes that you'll notice through this is there's fantasy kind of throughout, and if fantasy is your jam and you haven't read the Stormlight Archive, I understand, because I am also someone who does not like to pick up series that are not fully out yet. But this is a series that happens to be so full and dense. It is so good. It's this huge, sweeping, epic fantasy series with, politics and battle plans, and there's so many different people that have such huge character arcs that are happening. The fourth book is currently out this year. It just came out this last November. Rhythm of War. The Stormlight Archive is outstanding, though. It starts with The Way of Kings. So my boyfriend and I both read fantasy books. I read a lot of other things. He basically predominantly sticks to fantasy. We a lot of times like to read them together. This is the series that we have enjoyed the most. We love talking about it. We've both loved it. I was almost not going to put it on the list because the last one is not out, and that can possibly change my feelings about it, but I just kind of don't think so at this point. I think all of the books up to this point have been so outstanding that they're so good. Okay, so we are here for a long time. We've got a lot of books. Okay, so a couple nonfiction picks that I really, really loved if you haven't read them. Bossy Pants by Tina Fey. This was a read that I had in college and just loved it. I loved her on SNL. She had so many good little things about women and how to talk to your daughters and children and just insights on life that were just lovely and great and super funny. After that, another nonfiction one, it's an investigative journalism piece, and it's American Prisons. I've talked about this one before, and it's an underground look at... I'll link it in the description. It's a really long title, but it's by Shane Bauer. And basically what he did is he ended up going undercover in a Louisiana state prison as a guard. And he started to talk about the relationships between the guards and his own experiences and how that went. It is so good. And then this is probably the biggest nonfiction recommendation I can give, and it's just a personal favorite of my own, but it's John Krakauer's Into Thin Air. John Krakauer is a journalist and also a mountaineer. He writes for a lot of climbing magazines, but he happened to be on the mountain on the most, I believe it was 1996, when there were huge accidents. They had the most deaths on Everest, and he wrote a book about it. And not only did it kind of spark a love of nonfiction. John Krakauer is an amazing writer. He is an incredible writer. He writes nonfiction that's very accessible and reads, like in this one especially, because it's part memoir as well, as he experienced all of these things. He's an amazing writer. Okay, so now I've got a couple recommendations, and these are all graphic novels. I wanted to put them all together. The first one is Calvin and Hobbes. I have a few Calvin and Hobbes, actually, and it's not something that I talk about anymore or I hear anyone talking about because this is such a pillar, but I used to spend summers in Nicaragua, and I remember there was a few Calvin and Hobbes books there, and I literally would read them every single summer. I love them. They're wonderful. You can't say enough good things about them. They're awesome. If you haven't read the Calvin and Hobbes, you should. They're so cute. After that, I had some that were like, okay, I used to go to the library all the time, and if there was something weird, I checked it out. And one of those was Blankets by Craig Thompson. Thompson? Yeah, by Craig Thompson. And it's his graphic memoir. And I read it when I was like fairly young, and probably like a little too young for the material, to be honest, but it was really, really cool because I never envisioned that medium in that way. I had never read a graphic memoir of any kind. I'd never even read a like graphic novel, something that could be a story from beginning to end without it being a short comic kind of a thing. And it just really changed my mind or it really kind of opened my mind at that age to what stories could be and in ways that you could, and what ways you could tell them. And pretty much ever since then, I've always really sought to check them out, and I love them. After that, another one I found kind of around that same time was Persepolis. No, this one was one, they made a movie about it No, that's not true. I read it actually. Yeah, so this was another one I found at the library, and then really shortly after they ended up making a movie, and it was all the Persepolis series. But it's about the life of Marjane Satrapi, who wrote the series, and I don't remember if she illustrated it. I read these a long time ago, but it's essentially about her life and about her growing up in Tehran and kind of all of those issues. And it has a really, really cool art style that I also had really little to no experience with any of these art styles. So that was a huge, they're huge influences on me. Lastly, I can't believe this is my last recommendation. If you haven't checked this out, do so because it is amazing. I heard this series through Lee Nicole, and I'm so glad that I went and checked these out. I have never devoured anything so much with such a weird and out there and grotesque story, and it is fully amazing, fully hilarious, and just they're so good. I literally talked about these for probably over a year, and I'm still talking about them, and I want everyone to read them because they're just wonderful. This might also just show you how like little maybe I had delved into some of like the graphic novel series. I didn't know these were a thing up until I like later became an adult and started looking into it now, but this was kind of my first foray into it. It was also my first foray into booktube to a point, and wow, what a place to start. I couldn't have been happier. But the series is Chew. I'm probably not going to pull out the first one because I've never done this before, and I decided to today. It seemed like a good background. This is number 7, but it's Chew. It basically is this detective in this world that is ours but not, where there has been a outbreak of some kind, and all the chicken was deemed by the government that it was it basically was wiping out part of the population. So there's no chicken anymore, and they work for the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration, which at this point is like the FBI, because chicken crimes are basically where it's at. And it just gets so much more ridiculous from there. It's wonderful in every way. The story is so good. That was one of the things that I really realized kind of with this series is, which I know I keep saying this, but like what a story could be. And it was just like, it's like ridiculous fantasy humor. I don't know. It's so good. Anyway, so thank you for being here today and celebrating with me and learning a little bit about it and about me and some books that have shaped who I am and how I read now. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time. In a new year, it'll be a new me. I'll be in the club by the time you guys see this video.